You know, when someone disappears from your life, but not from your thoughts, people often think it means you're desperately in love, that you can't let go, or that you're meant to be together. But here's the thing. What really keeps someone in your mind without any communication isn't about cosmic connection or unfinished love stories. It's about understanding the psychology of emotional attachment and how your brain processes uncertainty. Think about it. The thoughts that consume us most aren't about the people who are consistently present. They're about the connections that remain unresolved. That's what creates mental preoccupation, not destiny, not perfect compatibility, but the emotional experience of ambiguity that your mind is desperately trying to resolve. When you can't stop thinking about someone who's no longer in your life, it's like your brain has become stuck in a loop, replaying moments, conversations, and possibilities. And what's fascinating is that this happens regardless of whether the relationship was long-term or brief, deeply meaningful or relatively new. The common denominator isn't the depth of the connection, it's the lack of resolution. A woman who creates lasting mental impact isn't necessarily one who shared the most history with you, or even the one who loved you most completely. Often, it's the one who left questions unanswered, potential unexplored, and meanings unclear. She's someone who created an emotional experience so complex that your mind can't easily categorize and file it away. Think about the people you've completely moved on from versus those who still occasionally appear in your thoughts years later. The difference isn't always about who was better for you or who you loved more. It's about completion. It's about whether your brain received the information it needed to fully process and integrate that experience. When a connection ends with clarity, even painful clarity, your mind can begin the process of acceptance and integration. But when it ends with ambiguity, with questions, with sudden disappearance, your thoughts keep returning to it, trying desperately to create the closure that was never provided. Your mind becomes like a detective with an unsolved case, constantly revisiting the evidence, looking for clues, trying to make sense of what happened. But here's what's critical about this pattern. Understanding it doesn't just help you make sense of why someone remains in your thoughts. It gives you the power to reclaim your mental space and emotional energy. Because when you understand the psychology behind these persistent thoughts, you can stop interpreting them as signs from the universe that this person is the one and start seeing them for what they really are, your mind's natural response to unprocessed emotional experiences. What makes this pattern so powerful is that it creates a mental loop you can't easily escape. A loop that takes valuable mental space that could be used for growth, connection, and moving forward. But here's what's critical. This isn't about vilifying the person you can't stop thinking about or beating yourself up for not being able to move on. It's not about labeling yourself as obsessed or weak. It's about creating genuine understanding of your own psychology so you can make conscious decisions about where your mental energy goes. And that understanding is where true emotional freedom begins. Some of you might be thinking, but shouldn't I just be able to decide not to think about someone and move on? Absolutely. In an ideal world, our thoughts would perfectly align with our intentions. But the human mind doesn't work that way. There's a difference between intellectual decisions and emotional processing. It's like the difference between deciding to be happy and actually feeling happy. Both are authentic desires, but one is an immediate choice while the other is a process that happens over time. When you communicate with yourself harshly about these persistent thoughts, demanding they stop or judging yourself for having them, you're not performing emotional strength. You're creating internal conflict that actually strengthens their hold on you. These thoughts aren't a failure of willpower. They're information from your emotional brain that something remains unprocessed, unintegrated, unresolved. Think about it this way. Your conscious mind might be ready to move on, but your emotional mind is still trying to protect you by solving the puzzle of what happened so you can avoid similar pain in the future. That's not weakness. That's your mind doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem isn't that you have these thoughts. It's that you don't understand what they're really telling you. What I'm going to share with you today isn't about magical thinking or instant fixes. It's about understanding the deeper psychology of why someone remains in your mind without communication, what that really means about your attachment patterns, and how to transform that understanding into freedom. Because when you truly understand why your mind holds on to certain people, you gain the power to change your relationship with those thoughts. We don't become fixated on what's fully understood and integrated. We become fixated on what feels important but incomplete. And when you recognize that, you can begin to shift how you interpret these persistent thoughts. They're not evidence of undying love or special connection. They're your mind's way of processing uncertainty. They're trying to protect you, even if they're causing suffering in the process. And that recognition is where healing begins. The first truth about this situation is what I call the uncertainty principle of attachment. And it means this: your mind obsesses not over what you fully had, but what you partially had. Most people make the mistake of thinking they can't stop thinking about someone because that person was so special or uniquely compatible with them. What actually creates this mental preoccupation is when you've experienced enough connection to feel its potential, but not enough consistency to feel its reality. When you experience a complete relationship, one with a clear beginning, middle, and end, your brain can process it as a whole story. Even if it was wonderful, even if you love deeply, your mind can integrate it because it has all the information it needs. But when you experience a partial connection, one that showed immense promise but never fully materialized, your brain keeps returning to it, trying to complete the narrative. It's like watching a movie that cuts off before the final act. No matter how many other complete movies you watch afterward, your mind keeps wondering how that unfinished one would have ended. That's not because it was necessarily the best movie. It's because it's the only one without resolution. Let me share a real example. I was coaching a woman named Claire who couldn't stop thinking about a man who disappeared after 2 amazing months together. When we dug deeper, we discovered she wasn't actually missing the relationship they had. She was caught in the loop of imagining the relationship they might have had. The inconsistency he showed created a form of intermittent reinforcement, the most addictive kind of emotional pattern. But Matt, she told me, we had such an incredible connection. I've never felt that way with anyone else. When I asked her to describe what made it so special, she described moments of intense emotional intimacy punctuated by periods of distance and unavailability. What she was experiencing wasn't necessarily an extraordinary connection. It was the heightened emotional state that comes from attachment uncertainty. This is crucial to understand. The intensity of your thoughts about someone is not necessarily proportional to how right they were for you. Often, it's proportional to how uncertain the attachment was. Think about relationships where you felt completely secure. While you may remember them fondly, they likely don't create the same obsessive thinking as the relationships where you constantly wondered where you stood. Claire's breakthrough came when she realized that what kept him in her thoughts wasn't his exceptional qualities, but the roller coaster pattern of their connection. When she examined her most persistent thoughts, they weren't about the experiences they actually shared. They were about imagining the relationship that might have been if things had continued. Why did this keep him in her thoughts? Because her brain was still working to solve the puzzle of who he really was and what might have been, not because he was her perfect match. Understanding this didn't immediately stop the thoughts, but it changed their meaning. They were no longer evidence of once-in-a-lifetime love. They were her mind's natural response to ambiguity. The second truth is what I call the mirror reflection, and it sounds counterintuitive. When someone remains in your thoughts without communication, you're often thinking about yourself, not them. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. That sounds impossible when you can literally see their face in your mind, hear their laugh, remember their words. But here's the psychology behind it. These persistent thoughts are usually less about the actual person and more about what they represented to you, validation you sought, parts of yourself you discovered in their presence, or who you hope to become in that relationship. Most people make the critical mistake of believing they're obsessing over the unique qualities of this specific person, their smile, their sense of humor, the way they made you feel understood. But what's actually happening is more complex. Your mind has created an attachment to what this connection symbolized in your life, to the identity it allowed you to step into, to the feelings it generated within you. I worked with a client named Michael who couldn't stop thinking about a woman who'd suddenly ended things. His mind was filled with thoughts of her, what she might be doing, who she might be with. I challenged him to examine what exactly he missed, and he realized something profound. He missed how confident he felt when she was interested in him, how the relationship represented a future he'd been dreaming about. But when I think about her, he insisted, I'm thinking about very specific things about her personality, her mannerisms, the conversations we had. And that was true. But when we dug deeper, we discovered that what made those specific qualities so persistent in his mind was what they meant about him. Her intelligence made him feel intellectually stimulated. Her beauty made him feel proud and chosen. Her interest in him made him feel worthy. This isn't to minimize genuine appreciation for another person, of course. You notice and value specific qualities in someone you care about. But when thoughts persist without any communication or presence, they transform into reflections of your own unfulfilled needs and desires. For Michael, the breakthrough came when he realized that many of the qualities he couldn't stop thinking about could actually be found in other people he knew. But they didn't create the same obsessive thinking because those relationships didn't trigger the same sense of validation and possibility. The thoughts weren't really about her, they were about his own identity and aspirations. This shift in perspective didn't make the thoughts disappear overnight, but it changed their meaning completely. Instead of seeing them as evidence that she was the one who got away, he began to see them as information about his own needs and values, needs he could potentially meet in other ways, with other people, sometimes even on his own. There's something incredibly liberating about this truth. When you recognize that persistent thoughts about someone are often reflections of your own unmet needs or unfulfilled potential, you reclaim your power. You're no longer waiting for that specific person to return in order to feel complete again. You can begin to identify what they represented and find new ways to create those same feelings and experiences in your life. Now let's talk about the third truth, the most powerful one of all. This is what I call the attachment paradox, and it works like this. The more you resist these thoughts, the more power you give them. This works on such a profound level because it speaks to our deep human tendency to push away uncomfortable feelings rather than moving through them. When you tell yourself you shouldn't be thinking about someone, that you need to move on, that it's pathetic to still have them in your mind, you're actually strengthening the neural pathways that keep them there. What we resist persists. What we fight grows stronger. This isn't spiritual mumbo jumbo, it's how your brain actually works. I remember working with a woman named Taylor who had been mentally torturing herself for months about a man who ghosted her. She'd been following all the conventional advice, blocking him on social media, throwing away reminders, telling herself to stop thinking about him. Yet the thoughts persisted. In fact, they seemed to be getting stronger despite her best efforts to eliminate them. I just want him out of my head, she told me, frustration evident in her voice. I've tried everything, but he's still the first thing I think about when I wake up, and the last thing on my mind before I sleep. When I asked her to describe her strategy for dealing with these thoughts, it became clear that she was waging an internal war against them. Every time he appeared in her mind, she would berate herself, try to force the thought away, or distract herself immediately. What Taylor didn't realize was that this resistance was like fuel to the fire. Each time she fought against a thought, she was essentially telling her brain, this is important, this matters, pay special attention to this. And our brains are designed to focus on what we flag as important. The breakthrough came when I suggested something counterintuitive. Instead of fighting these thoughts, what if she allowed them to be there without judgment? What if, when he appeared in her mind, she simply noticed it? Oh, I'm thinking about him again, without attaching a story of failure or desperation to it. When she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the pain and uncertainty without judgment, something remarkable happened. The thoughts didn't immediately disappear, but they lost their grip on her. Within a few weeks, she reported thinking about him less frequently and with less emotional intensity. Why? Because when we give ourselves permission to feel what we're feeling without resistance, we stop feeding the very cycle that keeps these thoughts alive. This is the paradox at work. Acceptance creates change. Fighting creates stagnation. When you stop treating these thoughts as problems to be eliminated and start treating them as natural responses to be observed, you create space for them to evolve and eventually transform. But let me be clear about something. Acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It doesn't mean believing you'll always be haunted by thoughts of this person. It simply means acknowledging what is true right now, that this person is in your thoughts without adding layers of judgment, shame, or desperate attempts at control. From that place of honest acceptance, real change becomes possible. Now that you understand these three powerful truths, let's talk about how to actually free your mind. First, understand that trying to force these thoughts away only strengthens them. What we resist persists. The goal isn't to never think about this person again. It's to change your relationship with those thoughts. Second, implement what I call scheduled reflection. Instead of being ambushed by thoughts throughout the day, set aside specific time, perhaps 15 minutes, where you allow yourself to think about this person completely and without judgment. Outside of that time, when thoughts arise, gently remind yourself, I have time set aside for this later. This practice works because it gives your mind the processing time it needs while also setting boundaries. Timing is crucial with this approach. The best moment to schedule this reflection is at the end of your day, not the beginning. Why? Because starting your day with these thoughts colors everything that follows. And never schedule this reflection right before bed, as it can disrupt your sleep and create a cycle of nighttime rumination. Third, when these thoughts arise, ask yourself, what need was this connection meeting for me? And how else might I meet that need? Remember the mirror reflection. These thoughts often reveal more about your unmet needs than about the other person. If you realize you miss feeling desired, find ways to cultivate self-appreciation and create connections where your value is recognized. If you miss intellectual stimulation, seek out conversations and communities that challenge your thinking. There's something else I want you to understand about these persistent thoughts. They're not just about missing someone. They're about your relationship with uncertainty and your own worth. This mental preoccupation isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you're human, capable of deep connection and processing an emotional experience. True emotional freedom doesn't come from never thinking about someone again. It comes from understanding what those thoughts represent and reclaiming the meaning they have in your life. A person doesn't stop appearing in your thoughts because you force them out. They stop dominating your thoughts when you've integrated what that connection taught you. Think about the relationships in your life that have meant the most to you. They weren't necessarily the longest or the ones with perfect closure. They were the ones that changed you, taught you something about yourself, showed you possibilities you hadn't seen before. That's why this person remains in your thoughts, not because you can't let go, but because on some level, this connection changed you. I worked with a client named James who couldn't stop thinking about a brief relationship that had ended abruptly. After months of trying to forget her, he finally asked himself what this connection had shown him about himself. The answer was transformative. For the first time, he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, to express needs he usually kept hidden. What he was actually holding on to wasn't just her, it was that version of himself he'd glimpsed in her presence. And once he recognized this, he could honor what the relationship had shown him while also understanding that he didn't need her specifically to continue being that more authentic version of himself. The thoughts didn't vanish overnight, but they transformed from painful reminders of loss to appreciated markers of growth. So yes, these three truths can create powerful shifts in how you understand your own mind and process unresolved connections. They can transform what feels like obsession into insight, what feels like weakness into self-acknowledge. But their true power comes from the self-compassion behind them when you approach these thoughts not as problems to eliminate, but as parts of your story to understand. The person who finds freedom isn't trying to erase their past with mental force. They're simply learning to carry it differently. They're recognizing the lessons, honoring the impact, and creating space for new connections and experiences. That kind of emotional intelligence doesn't just free you from intrusive thoughts. It creates the foundation for healthier relationships in the future, where uncertainty doesn't trigger the same patterns of mental preoccupation. That's not just moving on, that's true emotional growth. And that growth doesn't come from forgetting someone who once mattered to you. It comes from understanding why they matter still. Not because they hold your future in their hands, but because they were part of shaping who you've become. When you can see that clearly, without judgment or desperate attachment, you reclaim not just your mental space, but your emotional sovereignty. And that's where true peace begins, not in the absence of thoughts about someone, but in the transformation of what those thoughts mean to you. Not in forcing yourself to get over it, but in growing through it. Not in pretending they never mattered, but in understanding why they did, and using that understanding to create connections in the future that are based on wholeness rather than need, clarity rather than uncertainty, and mutual growth rather than emotional dependence. That's the freedom that awaits on the other side of these persistent thoughts. Not forgetting, but understanding. Not erasing, but integrating. Not moving on by force, but moving forward with